Everyone, it's John Barrett at Level Up Your Leadership, where I'm going to help you with visual leadership lessons to get better. I want to talk to you today about the communication scale. There's something that you need to understand as a leader. Part of your influence and your ability to impact people is going to be directly related to your ability to communicate. And the better you are at communicating with those around you, the more effective that you're going to be, the more influence that you're going to have. You're going to begin to level up, and you're going to begin to level up those around you because you're great at communicating. Now, this is something that most leaders, they struggle a little bit with. Nobody's putting time into that unless you're always getting in front of people and you want to be a speaker, you want to be someone who's able to deliver great presentations. Maybe you think about it, but for the most part, most leaders, that if they're not in front of big crowds, they don't really think about communication and being a better communicator. Now, what I want you to think about is, how do you develop your ability to communicate, and why is it so important? Because we have to understand that your influence and your impact are directly related to your ability to communicate, whether it's one-on-one, whether it's with a team or your organization as a whole, or to give a presentation on your department, or for the entire organization as the leader of this thing. You've got to be a great communicator. Whether or not you like getting in front of people or not, you've got to develop the skill. Now, what I want to talk to you about is this scale. This idea that in order to be a really great communicator, there's kind of this communication scale is what I call it, that you've got to understand. And if you don't understand this, then your communication is going to fall flat. In fact, you're going to assume that you're communicating really good when you're not. Because here's what happens. This is the challenge of the communication scale. That at whatever level that you think you're communicating at, the problem is that it's always a -2. And that's at best. It's a -2. So if you think as the leader, you're over here and you're communicating to your team, whether it's one-on-one, as a group, or whatever it is, let's just say that you give yourself a 7 out here on the scale. Well, I think I was a 7. I could have done better, but it was good. I think I really had clarity in my talking points. Well, listen, here's what you have to assume right off the top. And this isn't a negative statement. This is just the reality of communication. If you think you're a 7, your team is probably hearing that at about a 5 at best. It's always -2 on this side over here. Now, again, that's not a negative statement. It's just to say that things sometimes can get lost in translation. When you think that you've done a really good job communicating, sometimes that doesn't always get across. You know this to be true. There's been times as a leader where you've communicated to someone else or your team, and you've gone back and said, "Where did you hear that? That's not what I said at all. That's not what I was meaning at all." And you get misunderstood and misrepresented, or people hear something totally different. So you have to understand that over here, as the giver of communication, the one who's communicating, whatever level that you think at, it's going to be -2. So if you think that you were at a 9, you think, "Oh, great, I'm at a 9. It's best at 7 received by the team. At best. And I would say sometimes that can even drop a little lower, maybe to 3 points, maybe in extreme cases 4, if whatever the case may be. But it is almost always a -2 over here. So here's the danger in this, is that if you're leading and you're thinking, I've got to get better at communicating with my team. This is a skill that it's not my greatest trait. And you're giving yourself a 6 over here, it's being received by your team as a 4. I'll tell you what, that is not going to give clarity. That's not going to motivate, inspire, and help people get better. So you almost have to over-exaggerate your communication. If you want your communication to be an 8 or above, you've got to be at a 10 or higher in your communication. You may have to go to an 11 or 12, so to speak, in order to get there to a 10. You've got to over-exaggerate this so that it can be translated back here at a higher level. Now, in acting, they do this. They teach this in drama and stagecraft and those things where they teach you how to hone your craft as an actor. And they, especially in Broadway and live plays, they say you have to over-exaggerate your emotions. Because if you smile on the stage just a little bit, guess what? The person in the back row has to feel that smile. So you've got to over-exaggerate that without overacting and without making it obnoxiously over the top. But you've got to make sure that smile is big and it has some inflection with your body in that smile. So you can't just look at someone and go, in the back row, get that. You've got to have body language. You've got to be able to smile big so the back row can hear it. And it's the same for leaders. I remember hearing that principle growing up in school and doing some acting classes and things like that. And I remember thinking, that's exactly what leaders have to do. You have to over-exaggerate your communication. You've got to be at a 10 or a higher, because if you're not, it's not going to be received by your team. They're not going to get it. The person in the back row of your team is not going to connect with what you're saying. So what level do you think that you're communicating at right now? I just want you to think about that. And I want you to have some self-reflection and think about, what level would you give yourself right now overall? I know there's times you might be higher, maybe times lower, but overall, what would you say is your ability to communicate as a leader? What would you give yourself? Let's just say you gave yourself a 7, okay? You say, well, I've got a lot of room to improve, but I'm not terrible. Great, you're at a 7, awesome. That means that your team is at a 5 or below, is how they're hearing it. So what are you going to do to challenge yourself? Years ago, I heard a great story of an old preacher who was near retirement at his church. And he had this young, up-and-coming kind of preacher that he was mentoring and developing and that. So he gave him an opportunity. He said, why don't you give a sermon today from the pulpit and go for it. So the kid did some prep, got ready for it, and he got up and he gave the sermon, but he really wasn't completely prepared. He kind of fumbled through some of the thoughts and some of the ideas and really didn't give it his all and really wasn't able to communicate in a real clear way. And so afterwards, the preacher went up to him to give him some advice, and he said, listen, young man, here's what you've got to understand. I appreciate you getting up there and you're passionate about wanting to communicate, but you have to understand that you've got to be right on point. And this is what he said to him that I think is so powerful. He said, if it's a mist from the pulpit, it's a fog in the pew. And I remember hearing that, and I thought, ooh, that's a good statement for anyone communicating, no matter what you're communicating. That if it's a mist at the pulpit, then it's going to be a fog in the pew. I mean, if it's a mist from the leader and what you're communicating, it is a fog to the team over here and what they're receiving. So if you want to really raise your influence and be able to have that impact as a leader, you've got to make sure that you understand the communication scale and that you begin to elevate your communication more and more so that you can compensate for that -2 that sometimes will drive it down. That way you can be the best communicator you can. And if you do that, you're going to begin to have more influence, more impact in what you do. So go to johnbarrettleadership.com where you can check out the leader guide that has self-reflection questions about this, even for your team. There's group questions where you can talk about, how are we doing with communication? Where are we at? How do we understand this so that not just you as the leader with your team, but when your team is communicating to other departments and maybe even those that they're over underneath them, or vendors, or your clients and your customers that you serve, are you communicating at a level that is above what's being received? And if you can begin to raise that and understand this, you're going to be more effective. So go check it out. Reach out to us today so we can help take you and your team to the next level.